before that, always volunteered for nonprofits, including NAMI. I started out teaching as a volunteer our family classes. So 14 years is a long time, but I have a passion for mental illness. I'm a family member. I was born to a mother who already lived with mental illness. I have one sibling, and when I was 7 and she was 15, she also was diagnosed with the same illness as my mom, which is bipolar disorder. So, we're passionate at NAMI. I work in the state office, which is in St. Paul, and we do 3 things at NAMI. We do education, we do support, and we do advocacy. We're not direct service providers, so none of us are psychologists or none of us are advanced practice registered nurses. Those are called APRNs. We're not psychiatrists, which are medical doctors that have a residency and an internship in psychiatry. We really are advocates. We really are educators. And we also, of course, do support through our support groups and through outreach as well. So today, we're going to be talking about creating caring faith communities. And we want you to know we're statewide. We do have affiliate chapters, and it varies in the United States because every state does have a NAMI state chapter. We have a NAMI national office that is in Washington, D.C., and we all do the same thing, education, support, and advocacy. We do have affiliate chapters, and they look different kind of in every state because some states are more populous. So like in California, there's a state office that's in Sacramento, which is the capital, but there also is a NAMI Los Angeles. There's a NAMI San Francisco, there's a NAMI San Diego. And I only tell you that because they have some paid staff because they're so larger states. In Minnesota, we primarily are volunteer, and we tend to have affiliates that are multiple counties. With the exception in the metro area, there is a NAMI Ramsey County, there is a NAMI Hennepin County. But in other parts of the state, for example, in Rochester, we have a little bit of paid staff there, and they actually cover many counties, including Olmsted County, where Rochester is. So do know that we'd like to have more affiliate chapters. We've had a great deal of interest from the Albert Lea Freeborn area, but likely because of population, you'd probably be part of an affiliate that's multiple counties. We also, for example, have a Greater Duluth NAMI affiliate, and they kind of cover that whole North Shore Arrowhead region. So quite a few chapters there. And we just, have a passion for educating people, but also having change through advocacy. I think of the 3 things that we do as a 3-legged stool, and I could educate a lot about things like what's an arms worker, what's an ACT team, how do you get services in the state of Minnesota for mental illness. And I do the education, but then there's no funding for those services. And so that's where the advocacy part and legislative part intersects with education. And then with support, we get lots of ideas for education because of the phone calls that we get. We're a good resource. And so we have a helpline during business hours that we get quite a few calls, more than 4,000 or 5,000 a year. And we're not, again, a helpline or crisis line from that standpoint, but we are a helpline from the standpoint of resources. So our NAMI Minnesota website is on this slide. And so if you're looking for us, be sure you put in NAMI in Minnesota. Otherwise, you may go to our national website, which is fine, but it's not going to tell you what's going on in Minnesota. And then also, sometimes you'll get another state if you just put in NAMI. So NAMI Minnesota to find us. We've been around more than 45 years. So we actually were formed before the national office.
Ooh.
Today, our topic is creating caring communities, and many of our presentations are available for other organizations that you belong to, because obviously you are chamber members, so you probably are a company or a nonprofit, and we do a lot of presentations in faith communities. We do a lot of presentations for service clubs, if you belong also to Rotary, or I call them the animal clubs, lions, moose, elk, and service clubs like that. So there are presentations that are appropriate for your workplace. I teach quite a few suicide prevention classes in workplaces. I teach quite a few older adult programs. I have a whole series called Gray Matters that I do in nursing homes for their staff, for assisted living staff, for volunteers that do like Meals on Wheels, or volunteers that are befrienders in faith communities, because of course they work with older adults. Here's my contact information, and of course Sherry knows how to get a hold of me, but my email is there. And again, our phone number and our helpline, is business hours. But today we are going to talk about some crisis resources also, and they are not through NAMI, but we have compiled a pretty good list that Sherry has shared with you. And then if you'd be willing to fill out an evaluation form before you leave, we use data from our evaluations to apply for grants. We use data if we have a grant. We don't for this particular program, but we report back to the grantor. And so that's what we use our evaluation forms. Plus, someone like me who's an educator, we like to have feedback so that we can make adjustments to our education. So this presentation is kind of organized around 5 different things that we can do to make Minnesota a better place for people who experience a mental illness. And Albert Lea has always been pretty ahead of this curve. We have lots of communities in Minnesota, lots your size, some smaller, of course, some larger, but you already have had a focus on health. I've been to Albert Lea, not so much during the COVID time period, but before that, I've been to Albert Lea quite often to do some presentations. And they've sometimes been not the chamber hosted, but by other organizations. So I really think you already have a heart for this. You've had lots of programming. I've spoken once before to you. Just kudos, because not every community is reaching out to us. Our goal is we want people to be as productive as possible. And that the lowest unemployment rate 6 months ago for the whole United States was identified as Mankato, Minnesota. And that's where my sister lives. And she lives in adult foster care. And I only tell you this story is because we have really serious problems with employment in the serving sector, very specifically in healthcare. And so my sister lived in the same adult foster care in Mankato for 16 years. And last December, and by that I mean December 2021, on the week of Christmas, our family got a call that they were closing in 2 days because they had no staff. And this is my sister's home for 16 years. My sister's in a wheelchair. She also lives with bipolar disorder. And, she lives with housemates that she's lived with a long time. 3 of the housemates had lived together more than 10 years. So they're in some ways, her housemates / pseudo family in addition to her real family. And so consequently, we had to scramble. I mean, where are we going to find another place for my sister to live? So we had to do quite a bit of cobbling together for a few weeks until she now is in a permanent house again in Mankato with 3 other people. And there's not enough staff there either. There are 3 people in wheelchairs that need bathroom assistance in this house, in addition to living with other health conditions. And there's 1 person per shift, not because they're not authorized or there's not funding for more, there's no staff. So Mankato, whoever dreamed that would be the lowest unemployment rate of any city in the nation identified. And in Minnesota, we have less than 3% unemployment rate. And, your businesses are struggling to find workers too. But in healthcare, it's particularly hard because these are crucial. I mean, these are crucial positions. My sister's house is staffed 24/7. It needs to be for health purposes. And there's, in a nursing home, there's ratios, of course, that they can't have a wing open if there's not enough staffing. But that's one of the few senior facilities that has guidance that if you don't have enough staff per residence, you can't have those beds open. But that's not true in assisted living. That's not true with PCAs, which are personal care attendants. That's not true in adult foster care. So it's very difficult. So we want everyone to be able to work, and everybody does want to work. I had a coworker at NAMI when I first started, and she now works for the Department of Human Services. Her name's Shelley White. And Shelley said to me, I think I was a volunteer at the time, she said, "What do you think people want in life?" She said, I think they want 3 things. I think they want housing, a job, and a date on a Saturday night. And at the time I chuckled, right? But she's right. I thought about it more and think about it. A date on a Saturday night might be a romantic relationship, but quite frankly, it might very well be just friends and family to do things with. Housing is the bedrock for everything else we do. So you need that before you can really do anything else. And then the other part is, so the other part, of course, is a purpose. And, she said a job, but a purpose is, if you're in junior high school, it's going to school. Your job, if you have children, maybe is to be a stay-at-home parent. Your job, though, for most people is paid work, and people typically want paid work. And that includes people that manage mental illnesses as well. So it's us, it's us, it's not they, right? And illnesses are on a continuum. So I know many, many people, including my coworkers, that manage mental illnesses, and they live a life, they go to school, they raise kids, they work. And so we want to be sure that that unemployment rate is we're boosted with employees and people that want to work, people that can work, people that might manage mental illness. They already work. It's us, right? They already work. And those that don't, we want to make sure that they get the skills and job training and the supports that they need to be able to be successful in the workplace. And the other thing is, of course, that you come to work and you also have family members that manage illnesses like I do. And mental illnesses affect a whole family system. And it's nice to try to silo and say, okay, I'm at work and nothing's going to happen. That it's going to pull me away from my work that's family related. But that's not true. So if you were up all night because you had a 16-year-old in the emergency room with suicidal thoughts, and yes, you are at work the next day, but it's pretty hard to concentrate when you're just worried sick, about your family member, as an example. And the same thing could be true if you were worried about an older parent who has memory loss and has been missing. They walked out the door and they've been missing for 3 hours and it's cold outside. How do you silo that, when you're at work? So we're not there yet, where people are leading a full life. And just a few basics, and you've heard maybe some of these before, but mental illnesses have young person onset. So 50% of mental illnesses begin by age 14 if you're going to live with one in your lifetime. And that figure rises to 75% by age 24. So that just leaves 25% of people who might develop some signs and symptoms after age 24. And I'll give you an example just so you can relate to it, is that if you carry a baby, you're having a baby, about 20 to 30% of women that carry a baby develop postpartum depression. It's a type of major depression, and that would be counted, in that figure. So you certainly could have your first child at 30. And so remember I said 75% of people have their signs and symptoms before age 24. Well, I gave you an exception. Someone could have their first child at 30 and develop postpartum depression, which is a type of major depression. And by the way, it's very treatable, but it would get counted. With youth, this is very concerning because obviously we spend a lot of time with early childhood education and want to spend more time and money on that. And also we want young people to be successful. They're our future for many reasons. So 7 out of 10 youth that have some signs and symptoms are in the juvenile justice system. And you know what? That's not a healthcare system. And so obviously we want to have interventions for people that have their first signs and symptoms young to give them the help that they need. My analogy is, with cancer, you want to catch cancer at stage 1. You hope you don't catch it at stage 4. You hope you catch it, obviously. But, we want to help people and give them the supports they need when they need it, which is often before age 24. And then 6 out of 10 youth that have some signs and symptoms are not receiving treatment. And you probably heard the news report this week. It was in the Star Tribune. I didn't hear it on television, but I bet it was there. Is that the Center for Disease Control just had a pretty good study that just talked about youth and mental illness. And that survey was done with figures before the end of 2021. We're already in 2023. And so we just think it's all COVID related. It is not all COVID related. It is not all related to Ukraine. It's not all related to contentious elections. Some of this was surveyed, long before the end of 2021. So, it's important to pay attention. You already are. You asked me to speak. You have this as an initiative. But 6 out of 10 youth, that means people under 18, are not receiving treatment. We've got to make that better. And then 5 out of 10 youth that are 14 and older that have some signs and symptoms leave school. Well, if you don't have a GED or you don't have a diploma or you don't have even some post-secondary education, it's really hard to make a life. And as people that are employers, you certainly, of course, want people that can work as well. It's win-win-win for everybody. And 1 in 5 adults, as well as 1 in 5 youth under 18, live with a mental illness in a given year. So that's 20% of our population. It's a lot. And so it sometimes surprises me, and that's why I still work in mental health here 15 years later. I'm going into my 15th year with NAMI, is because we've got to do better. It's a large part of our population. And, you know, mental health intersects with so many other things. It intersects with employment. It intersects with criminal justice. It intersects with education. I just can't think of anything it doesn't intersect with. So with adults, you know, 4 out of 10 adults that live with a serious mental illness. And my concept is that there's mild, moderate, severe. Same is true with all illnesses. You can have mild diabetes, moderate diabetes, really severe. Really severe might mean even if you do all the things that are helpful, like diet, exercise, perhaps you use a medication for your diabetes, you still can't get your blood sugar regulated. So that would be really serious, right? The same thing is true with mental illness. You can have mild schizophrenia, moderate schizophrenia, really severe. So in this bullet point where it says serious mental illness, I'm not talking about mild anxiety disorder. I'm talking about really severe anxiety disorder. I'm not talking about mild bipolar disorder. I'm really talking about severe bipolar disorder. So 4 out of 10 that live with a more serious form of one of the mental illnesses are not receiving treatment. And mental illness, you know, we're not just neck up, neck down. We're certainly integrated beings. And so all the parts of ourselves communicate with each other. And then 8 out of 10 adults that live with mental illnesses are not in the workforce. So that's where our opportunity is. And, you know, there are programs and things that help people with wraparound services, but that costs money. And it also requires that our workforce employers, you know, understand mental illness, make accommodations, provide support, and you're going to get a great employee. And the last one, 1 out of 4 adults with mental illnesses are in the criminal justice system. So our largest jail in Minnesota is in Hennepin County, where I live. And, you know, the present sheriff is new in the job. It's a female Black woman named Dwana Witt. And she actually will tell you this, as did her predecessor Hutchinson, as did the predecessor of Hutchinson, which is Stanek. They will tell you that probably about 30% of the people in the Hennepin County jail manage a mental illness. And when I say manage, maybe experience would be the better word, because they aren't necessarily even diagnosed and certainly are not receiving treatment in jail. So just know prison system, probably about the same. But at least in the prison system, it's a longer term stay. And I don't mean that at all ironically, a longer term stay that perhaps you'll have some health care there, but that's not what our jails are set up to do. So the 5 things that I said we'd kind of organize our hour around is kind of shift how we see and how we have relationships with people that are experiencing a mental illness, you know, learning respectful, accurate language, know that the media very much does affect, you know, how we view mental illness, know a few mental illness basics. That's not the heart of this today, because, you know, really Sherry wanted us to start the conversation a little bit about, you know, what can we do in Albert Lea that we aren't already doing to, you know, be better advocates for mental illness. You know, how do we facilitate change in the community? You know, how do we use our skills for legislative advocacy, that sort of thing. So we'll get a start on that, but that's something that I'll turn over to you, because that's something you have to work in smaller groups probably on. But we also want you know, to have communities with hope and support, and, you know, let people be their best selves and let families be able to flourish. So these are really basic things. I know you know them, but it's kind of good to get reinforced, is that mental illnesses, you know, are not caused by the person themselves. They're not caused by family members, right? You know, mental illnesses, the theory is you're born with a predisposition, something puts it in motion. And what puts it in motion is often referred to as a second hit. So trauma could be a second hit. And by the way, there's really no testing to find out if you have a predisposition. So there's no, for example, X-ray, there's no PET scan of the brain, there's no CAT scan, there's no urinalysis, there's no blood test. Now, in my family, there actually is a genetic component, nothing that anyone's done a DNA test, that doesn't exist. But, you know, I can look at 4 generations of my family. I'm from Le Sueur, Minnesota, and I can look at 4 generations of my family and know that 50% of my family manages a mental illness. And that goes back, you know, into the 1800s, when some of my great aunts and uncles and grandparents were born. And so, you know, I could see that, but I don't have a test to say I have a genetic component. So as an example, my grandma was one of 10 on a farm in Le Sueur, and my grandma lived with mental illness, as did 4 of her siblings. So it was about 50%. And I knew the great aunts and uncles. My grandma died before I was born. I also, my mom is one of four. And so my mom and two of her siblings lived with mental illness and one did not. And by the way, they all went to college, they raised kids, things like that, but they still had to manage a mental illness. My mom, two children. My sister lives with a mental illness. I'm lucky, I don't. My sister has two children. One of my nieces lives with a mental illness. I don't. So there's a genetic component in my family, but genetics is only part of it. So I think someday we're going to find out that it's multifactorial, right? Not one cause. As we know, when you treat mental health concerns, that's multifactorial also. It's not just one thing you do to manage your mental health or your mental illness. So it's really complicated. The brain is complicated. And I'm not going to be spending our time too much on this, but you can take other classes from us, and we have many. I teach 25 different classes. Some are 8 hours. The other thing is that environment can play a role. We are more susceptible in Minnesota to a type of major depression called SAD disorder. It stands for seasonal affective disorder. Not everybody that lives in Minnesota in the winter manages SAD disorder, but we get less sunlight in Minnesota than you do in Texas or Florida or South America or Mexico. And consequently, we're at greater risk for that type of disorder. The other thing is trauma that has to do with negative life experiences. And you can see some of those examples in the sub-bullet point where it says negative life experiences. And that could also include, experiences such as tornadoes or hurricanes or war. I mean, there's things like that as well. And there are some medical conditions that are very, very stressful, and people have had to manage them a long time. And there's some examples of that. And, mental health concerns and substances just don't mix. I mean, I realize that alcohol is legal and people use it. I'm not a goody two shoes, but, if you have a susceptible brain, and by the way, there's no test to tell that you do, but if you have a susceptible brain, it just doesn't mix with alcohol and drugs. You're introducing some other chemical into a system. The other thing is that, loneliness, isolation, not just the kind that was brought on by COVID. We have older adults that have also had loneliness and isolation. We have veterans that have come back from serving and have been felt isolated and lonely. So it's not just COVID, but certainly COVID has made it worse. And the last bullet point is probably the most important on this slide, is that mental illnesses are treatable. Are you always cured? No, not always. But quite frankly, there's lots of hope, lots of good stories. And I'm going to actually tell you a statistic that I think is very hopeful. Schizophrenia is not that common. It's a mental illness. It's less than 1% of our population. And about a third of the people that have a diagnosis of schizophrenia have one episode and never have another one. A middle third of people that live with schizophrenia have to manage it, live with it, live a life, still have schizophrenia, but they live a life. And then the last third of people that manage schizophrenia, it's like a wildfire burning through their brain, it causes brain damage. And so that's not happy, but that's only a third of people that already have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. So I just want you to know that even something that sounds pretty serious and is not very common, pretty treatable. So that's not false hope. I know many, many thousands of people personally, as acquaintances, not all good close friends, but that are managing mental illness and are doing, their very best and are very, very productive people in our society, raising kids, going to school, working. This is from SAMHSA, which is a government agency. It's the Substance Abuse Mental Health Administration, and that's a good resource. So it's a government, it's a .gov website, but it's SAMHSA, and it's an acronym. But they put out this chart, and the concept, you've probably seen this concept before, not just from SAMHSA. And I always smile because all these circles are exactly the same size. So it sort of says, okay, every part of your life for wellness is equal. Well, take a look at this chart and then you start thinking about yesterday and say, oh yeah, I spent, 1/16 of my time yesterday on my spiritual life. And I spent 1/16 of my life yesterday on exercise and, the physical. Oh yeah, and I spent, 1/16 of my life yesterday on occupational. Quite frankly, I'm lucky if I get my work done and maybe get out for a walk. And so I'd like to say that we work on all aspects of our life every day. Not true. It's too hard, not enough time. But I do think we aspire to work in all of these areas of our life. And sometimes we are able to do a little bit each week or a little bit each month. But these are all parts of recovery, not just for mental illness. That's what it was designed for, but also for, recovering from any health concern that we have. So no surprises here, but I do like the poster. And SAMHSA used to print them so that, in the olden days when you put stuff up on the bulletin board, but you certainly from SAMHSA can use this. And if it's something that would be helpful in your workplace, I think it's just good to be a reminder about what are the components of wellness, including mental health. Then one of our other 5 things is shift our perceptions and behaviors. And if you have anything you want to put in the chat, or if you want to talk at all, we're a small group, you certainly are very welcome to add ideas, and you're very welcome to ask a question. I'm good with resources, so if I don't know the answer, I probably can put you in touch with someone who does. The other thing is I can probably give you a resource if you want to read more about something. So just put that in the chat, and I'll certainly check in with Sherry to see if anyone has any comments or questions. So, it's important to remember that mental illnesses are illnesses, because I think sometimes people think, gosh, that person is just trying to be oppositional, or we think, oh, that person is just trying to ruin our family holiday, or that person is, trying to stay at home and not work, and we're not able to do our completion of our work today because we don't have our employee here, or that the person hasn't prayed enough, or that they're using drugs and alcohol and they're an addict. You've heard name calling like that before, right? So we just need to change attitudes, because, the components of discrimination and stigma really come up very much so with mental illness, much more so than other illnesses. And, we don't, yes, mental illness is covered by the American Disabilities Act, the ADA, but when someone is not feeling well, it is really hard to, go through a procedure of saying I'm not being treated fairly because of my mental illness, right? And so most people just go away, they just quit, if the employer is not supportive. So, if you also get in the criminal justice system, some of the things that are affected, there's many things affected, but some of the main things that are affected if you have a misdemeanor or you have a felony would be job hiring, and also being able to find housing. And so that's just 2 of the things, but those are pretty hard if something happens where you get a criminal record. So obviously we want to intervene before someone gets a criminal record. We want to intervene before someone drops out of high school. So it's really important. And also relationships are important. And it's referred to here as social interactions, but our relationships with others are really important. So yes, we want people to understand and accept, but none of us had any training in 10th grade health class. So how would you know until either a person that works for you has struggled and you're trying to learn more about mental illness, or your family, has had some struggles, and that's when you get a crash course in how does this work, this mental health system. I teach a family class for NAMI. I've taught it 16, this is my 16th year, did it before I started with NAMI. My class actually starts in March, and we have 3 spots available, and it's online, and it was 12 weeks. Now it's an 8-week class. So it's taught nationwide. It's called Family to Family. So if you're a family member of someone who lives with mental illness, we've been teaching this class for more than 30 years, and I've been teaching it more than 16. So it's really helpful to learn about mental illness if you have family members, and you could be a parent. And by the way, I almost always have 80-year-old parents that have 55-year-old children in my class. I sometimes have parents that are 45 that have a 20-something child in the class. I sometimes have aunts and uncles. I have spouses and partners. I have grandparents that want to support their grandchild. So it's a good class. And, one thing when I think about what can Albert Lea do is that, wouldn't it be great if you had at least a class a year in Albert Lea? We train teachers, but you have to take it first and then be committed, to teach it. And you have to be a family member to take it, and you have to be a family member to teach it. So I'm just saying, when I think of things that you can do in your community, having classes, including intensive ones like the family to family class, I think would be great. We take 22 in a class, and my class has been publicized now for 2 weeks, and I have 3 spots left. So we have other classes, but the class that I'm going to be teaching is almost full. And the other two that are in progress right now, they're full. So, and because it's online, you can join from anywhere in Minnesota, which is nice because we don't have classes obviously in every city and every town. So now I'm not going to spend much time on this. I find it a little bit negative. I didn't write this part of this presentation, but they're the words that are so stigmatizing. I can have you do this silently to yourself, but it's that crazy nuts cuckoo stuff, right? And I don't usually hear it in the sense of mental illness. I'll hear somebody say, oh, it's such a crazy day at work today. And what they're referring to is it's extremely busy. And I'd like you to consider using more precise language, because when you use words like crazy, nuts, cuckoo, psycho, all those kind of words, you're really talking about my family. You're talking about my grandma. You're talking about my mom. You're talking about my only sibling. You're talking about most of my coworkers. And so it's really, really hurtful. It also is the main reason that people wait so long to get help with symptoms of mental illness. The average wait is 10 years. Some get help before 10 years, half. Half get help after 10 years or never get help. And the primary reason, there's many reasons, but the primary reason is stigma and discrimination. So one way we can change that is just changing our language. So here are the words. I just really find this too negative. You know what they are. So let's talk more about respectful and accurate language. And so I'm not very good at looking at chat at the same time as talking. So just interrupt me and I'll share if you need to, if there's anything in the chat we should talk about. Is there anything?
Sorry, I had to unmute. No, there's nothing in there yet.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
So person first language, just like you see on the screen that I use the pronoun she and her. And so, people at NAMI, we try to say our pronouns, for example. But same thing with language. It's hard to change old habits. Like I'm still here every day and it's okay, but I want people to try, this is crazy day. Just try to be more precise if you can be. So you've heard me model it already, but with my mom, she passed away in her 80s and she managed an illness since she was 18 in college. And so my dad had a restaurant in Le Sueur. They were equal financial partners. They both worked in it. My mom was the public librarian for a number of years. So my mom lived a life, but she also lived with pretty severe bipolar disorder. She was hospitalized probably 30 times before she died for her mental health. And you're not hospitalized really unless you're harmed to yourself. So my mom lived with bipolar disorder. It's not how she would define herself. It's not how I defined her. She's not an illness. She's so many other things. A person can manage schizophrenia. They can live with schizophrenia. They can experience schizophrenia. So living with, managing, and experiencing are a good way instead of saying somebody's schizophrenic. People are not illnesses. I don't say somebody's diabetic. You live with diabetes, you manage diabetes, you experience diabetes, because that's not who you are. You're a business owner, you're a mother, you're a teacher, those sorts of things. And then, each illness is different. So you can say mental illnesses, that's fine, or you can say a mental illness, that's also fine. But just be careful with language. We also try not to use suffering because suffering doesn't give much hope, and actually there is quite a lot of hope. And so suffering, last year, meaning 2022, I would have said my sister did suffer. And she suffered because she had to move into new housing. She had chaos for about a month before she had stable housing again. She was hospitalized 5 times, not for mental illness. She was hospitalized for things that were part of that transition. She got COVID twice. She was boosted and she was hospitalized. She also had her blocked small intestine twice. And my sister has had intestinal issues. And so it's related to food products and really serious. I mean, they almost had her on the operating table for one of them because it was blocked. And so I just want you to know that I would say suffering last year for Gretchen. I want to say that because I'm trying to put emphasis. But for most people living day to day with a mental illness, by using those kinds of words, it really prevents that young person who wants to get help to think, oh, so I'm going to suffer for the rest of my life. You mean I'm never going to get better? The other thing is, same thing when using chronic illnesses or lifelong, there's not much hope in that either. Probably better to say treatable, a serious illness, if it is serious. So, just, you understand, I think, person first language. We try not to call people with developmental disabilities retarded. I think the last time I heard that was on the playground, but I suspect that's still used too. But, people live with Down syndrome or they live with a developmental disability, but that's not who they are. Now, the media does certainly influence how we see things. And, I wrote actually my mom's obituary, and I didn't deliver her eulogy. I had a family friend do that. But, I used words like generous, courageous, determined, inspirational. And the person who did my mom's eulogy did a great analogy. Le Sueur is on the Minnesota River, and we lived on top of the hill, and at the bottom of the hill is where Main Street is. And that's where our restaurant was, that's where the library was. And so they used the metaphor of my mom, who did not drive, every day walking up and down the hill to get to work. And, pretty expansive hill. And so they used that as a metaphor for my mom. It was perfect. I didn't suggest it. My family friend did, and it was perfect. But those are what my mom was. My mom was not an illness. And the other thing is that, there's not very many good TV shows that portray mental illness kind of as it is. Instead, to make good drama, people don't live with mild anxiety disorder in TV shows, right? It's always in dramatic fashion. They must be somehow a violent person and then living with mental illness. So unfortunately, that really reinforces, a stereotype that is not true. People that live with mental illness are no more violent than the general population, with the exception, if someone lives with a really severe mental illness, not mild, not moderate, but really severe, and they are untreated, they have about a 5% greater incidence of violence. So first of all, you're taking the whole population, then you're taking people that live with mental illness, then you're taking people that only live with severe mental illness, not mild or moderate, and then you're saying 5% of those that are untreated. It's very, very small. So when you see things in the media, you think, oh my gosh, that grocery store in Buffalo. Well, I've read the same things you have. It appears that that was racially motivated and had nothing to do with mental illness, as an example. But, when we hear heinous things, we think, oh my gosh, that must be mental illness. Not likely, sometimes. But there's lots of people living with mental illness that have never been violent at all, the majority. And then when media does, kind of misstep, it's time to speak out, because if nobody draws the line in the sand about something that clashes with your values, then things don't change. So it's important to speak out, letters to the editor. It's important to speak out, talk to your legislators. It's important to speak out if the media, uses incorrect language. All those things are important, and you have to kind of decide what fight you want to be in, right? You pull aside maybe a family friend who says to you, why does your son still live with you in the basement? He's 40 years old. You should kick him out. Tough love. I'm not sure we want to be told how to parent our 40-year-old child. Instead, wouldn't it be helpful if they said, gosh, why don't you take vacation? I'll check in on Bob. Or how about if, we have this gift card. We'd love to share it with you. We got it for Christmas and we can't use it. Here's a $100 gift card for Bob. Things like that are so much more helpful than telling you how to parent your 40-year-old or suggesting that why are they still living with you and why aren't they in college or why aren't they doing this, yada, yada, yada. Now, I'm not going to talk about illnesses, but I want you to know where you can find information. So I'm more going to give you resources. If you want to know about individual illnesses, not so you can diagnose your brother-in-law, right? But if you want to learn about individual illnesses, the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, is a good place. When you go to their website, they have information about different illnesses. You could go to like a Mayo Clinic website, or you could go to a Johns Hopkins University website or the Cleveland Clinic and things like that. And they do a good job, I think, of describing illnesses. I always, when I look on the web, right, on the internet, I always try to think, okay, what's the motivation of this website? Is it trying to sell something? Because quite frankly, healthcare is trying to sell something. They're trying to sell you to come to the Mayo Clinic and get your healthcare. Nothing wrong with that. I just want you to know that just always remember what's the source. So drug companies that make drugs for mental illness, they know a lot about those illnesses. So I might look at a drug company's website for a drug for schizophrenia, but I always want to have in the back of my mind that they're also trying to sell drugs for schizophrenia. However, they might know lots about it, which they do. So just take everything you read with a little bit of grain of salt, because we mostly go to the internet to get our information. So,
Hey,
major
can I-
depression.
Oops.
Oh.
Oh, I was just gonna say in the chat, along with, what you read and what you hear, someone mentioned in the chat on national news this week, they brought up the huge number of young girls suffering and thinking of ending their lives. She said, anything we can do locally.
Yeah, I think that might want to be on your list of things that the Resiliency Committee talks about. And that's what I was referring to earlier. I said this week, the Star Tribune had an article, the National News, and that was from the Center for Disease Control, which is based in Atlanta. And that study was the one that was data from through 2021. And so thank you for bringing that up. If you haven't read it, it's disturbing to read. It's not just young teen girls, it's that age group, but then among that age group, it's young teen girls. And then among that age group, it's also Black young teen girls at even a higher incidence. And those figures are just astronomical. So please try to look at that. I think it was in the Star Tribune this week. It was front page. So, but it is a national article because it was from the Center for Disease Control. So thank you for bringing that up. But if you want to learn about different illnesses, we have fact sheets at the NAMI Minnesota website, and we also, our national NAMI has fact sheets as well. Depressive disorder is a large umbrella. I talked about two of the types today. SAD disorder is one that I talked about. Seasonal affective disorder is what that stands for. And I talked about postpartum depression. They fall under kind of that tent of major depressive disorder. Anxiety disorder is also a big tent. Panic disorder falls under that. Phobias fall under that. Generalized anxiety disorder. So that's kind of a big tent also. Bipolar disorder, not as common. Anxiety disorders are the most common of the mental illnesses. They're 3 times more common than major depression. So in a given year, anxiety disorders are over 18% of our population in a given year. And bipolar disorder is less than 4%. Schizophrenia is less than 1%. So you can see anxiety disorder is most common by a lot. And major depression, under 7%. So it's about a third of anxiety disorders. Eating disorders are a mental illness. I tell people we're lucky in Minnesota. We have 2 eating disorder programs that have inpatient as well as outpatient treatment. One is called the Emily Program, and the other is called the Melrose Institute. And they have inpatient and they also have outpatient. And eating disorders can be hard. The most common eating disorder is binge eating, but anorexia and bulimia are also in that disorder category. And the other thing is that it's the most fatal of all the mental illnesses. So eating disorders are the most fatal of the mental illnesses. And it's because if you have something like anorexia, and if you're old enough, the name Karen Carpenter would be an example. She lived with anorexia and she died of heart failure because there's direct correlation when you have really severe anorexia, very high fatality. So it's hard to treat. Eating disorders are hard to treat, but we have help. So, that would be good to know where your resources are if you know someone who's managing an eating disorder. Borderline personality disorder, there's a really good association for borderline personality disorder. It's national. So if you put in those words and put in association, you'll be able to find more information. They have a class for family members that can be taken. And so that's all on their website. But that can be a hard illness too. All of them can be. So when I meet people that live with these illnesses, they're my heroes. I mean, these are people that are living a life, right? So this is just to talk about a few. There are many other mental illnesses out there. You can take classes that have a little more information, like Mental Health First Aid, which is an 8-hour class, has more information. But look at fact sheets. So National Institute of Mental Health, NAMI, we have fact sheets on the illnesses. But don't read them to diagnose your family members. You need to be a doctor to do that. You need to be a master's level social worker. You need to be an advanced practice RN. You need to be a psychologist. Those are the folks that make diagnoses. Most people get diagnosed by their family doctor or by a nurse practitioner. Obsessive compulsive disorder. There is a good resource in Wisconsin. It's called Rogers Memorial, and they've opened some clinics recently in Minnesota, and they do have a specialty in obsessive compulsive disorder. And that is its own category. And do know that people joke sometimes about it, and it's really not a joking matter. If it's a diagnosable illness, it's not people that just have all their closets organized by color, right? It's not that they have all their LPs organized by title and author, or not musician, I should say. And so, no, I mean, it's not something, oh, that person's so OCD. No, this is an illness. And for some people, very serious. because again, it's on a continuum. Post-traumatic stress disorder certainly is not just for veterans. And there have been, many, many tragic things, and especially in these last number of years, that certainly could be that second hit that puts something like PTSD in place. And then schizophrenia, not very common, less than 1% of our population, but if it affects someone in your family, usually a psychosis happens, which is a break from reality. And a break from reality could be hallucinations, could be a delusion. Delusion is a false belief. So, it's important to get help for people if they have their first break from reality. There are first episode psychosis programs, and we have 4 in the state of Minnesota, 1 in Duluth, 2 at downtown Minneapolis, 1 in downtown Minneapolis and 2 at the University of Minnesota in the metro area. So we could use more. Now, I promised I'd talk a little bit about crisis. I'm only going to talk about this slide, but so Sherry has a crisis sheet. It's a 2-pager, and we hand it out in every class that we teach. And so, Sherry, do you want to just mention how you're going to distribute that? It's called the Crisis
so I
Resource.
was trying to put the attachment in the chat, and I'm not able to do that. So I will just email that out and make it available. Again, we can make it available through Chambermaster and also on the website.
And spread it to the world. Once you have that document.
For sure.
Yeah, it's not just for this group. We'd like everyone to get some of these numbers into their phone. And so there's a wide range on that 2-page sheet. I'm just pointing out some of the key ones. So you probably know that in July of last year, there was a 1-800 crisis and suicide prevention number for mental health. It's been around for a number of years, but it changed to a 3-digit number last July. So now it's 988. So until you memorize that, put it in your phone. It's 24/7. You can call it, you can text it, and there's also a chat. And it can be for people that are struggling themselves, or it could be a family member that needs some coaching. And we have 4 call centers in Minnesota. It varies by state. We have 4 call centers. And so when you dial 988, if your area code is a Minnesota area code on your phone, you'll go to a call center in Minnesota. Right now, there's no funding nationwide to have a GPS related to that. It's available as software. It's just there's no funding. So if you have a 614 area code, which is Ohio, you're going to go to a call center in Ohio. Nothing wrong with that. They can help. But each mental health system in each state is different. So they'll eventually get you to Minnesota, but they can help you immediately in the call center because they understand the general concepts, but they don't know Minnesota's resources. So again, if you're using a cell, which most people are, if you have an area code that's not a Minnesota one, you're going to go to the call center where that area code is until we get funding. And that has to be national funding and state funding. But it's a good number to have. They can be very helpful. If you're a veteran, it will prompt you when you call 988, it will prompt you, and then you can get someone who will answer the call that understands veterans. There's also a national crisis text line. It's 741-741. And that number is national. It's been around for about 5 or 6 years. And we want you to put MN in the message because we'd like the responder for that crisis text line when they get back to you or whoever's texted that they are a Minnesota person if possible. And they're only going to know that, if you put Minnesota in the actual message body. We have 87 counties in Minnesota, Freeborn being one of them. And every county has its own crisis team that's mobile. And so you can, on a cell phone, do **274-747, and you have to use the stars. And make sure that your carrier accepts that kind of call because not all carriers do. So it's good to test it before there's an emergency. So again, it's **274-747. Now, they have to triage. They don't have mobile teams that can go to every place that's calling and there's a crisis. And they have to triage. So some of their coaching is done by phone, but it is a good place to get help, and oftentimes they can come in person. If there is a weapon involved, for example, someone's thinking of suicide and they have a weapon, and you're telling that to the crisis team, they're going to also have law enforcement join them because the crisis teams are social workers. They are perhaps nurses. They can probably have a psychologist that supervises them. And so just know that they are not going to a mobile site without backup if a weapon is involved. And I don't mean weapons usually going to be used outwardly. I mean, usually the weapon is related to someone having suicidal thoughts. This is very brief because this isn't the topic today, so take a class if you want more nuances. 911 is okay to call. I would call it if a weapon was involved because you save time. Doesn't mean you don't want the mobile crisis team to come out also, but they're going to have law enforcement come with them, county law enforcement or city police departments. And I always ask when I talk to the dispatcher, I'd like a CIT trained officer, which means that they've had 40 hours of mental health training. CIT stands for crisis intervention trained. And many officers have been trained, but it's a cost issue. You know, getting all officers on a force means having them off the force for 40 hours for the training and paying them for that, in addition to having someone in the squad taking their place, in addition to paying for the actual training. So it's not that officers don't want the training. Sometimes they have to train a few at a time because of budget purposes. And so if you want to also, in addition to having ** 274747 in your phone, sometimes cell phones don't work, the towers don't work. And so it's good to have the landlines also. So Freeborn County has a landline number. So does Hennepin County. So does, St. Louis County in the Duluth area. So you can get a list of all 87 counties' landline numbers at the DHS website, which is there. And this is all on this 2-page document, that Sherry is going to share with you. And then also you can get those numbers by just going to the county website for that county. So you could go to Freeborn County's website and get it there. We have suicide prevention classes. If you go to the NAMI Minnesota website, I teach 3 of these. And so, take advantage of those. You can have them as an employer for your employees, but talk to us if you would like to schedule something like that, or the chamber can host one. And then the last one is, you do what you do for any illness. If there's been a tragedy in town, maybe a fire where there's lives lost in Albert Lea, you're going to do all the things to help support that family. If someone lives with ALS and, there's a fundraiser to buy some equipment for that person in the final months of their life so that they can live at home with their ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, you do all these sorts of things. You offer to help, you raise money, you reach out, you lean in, you text, you bring food over, all those things. Well, you do the same thing, of course, for mental illness. The caring concerns list might be at a faith community where you have prayer lists. It might be using Caring Bridge with the permission, of course, of the person who's ill. And so there's lots of things you do, but remember, you can do those same things when someone's brain is not working optimally as well. So, what can you do to make sure mental health resources are available? That's one thing I think certainly you can do in Albert Lea and Freeborn County is, work with the libraries, not just during Mental Health Month when they might pull books out and have kind of a special display. You can make sure that there's brochures and things available in workplaces, in public areas, in faith communities. And when there's that not in my backyard, I have enough examples to fill a notebook. Don't know what's happening in your county, but there's a lot happening here where it doesn't look like it's not in my backyard, but sure smells like it. And I don't have much time, and I do want to talk a little bit of some ideas to just start percolating with Freeborn County, but your meetings are short. So some of this, you can continue the discussion, but I'll briefly give you one. It's Forest Lake. So there was a farmer in Forest Lake right before COVID who had land that they were going to sell to an organization that was going to build a children's inpatient unit. So it was going to create about 100 jobs. The Economic Council for Forest Lake, with zoning and Economic Council, they approved it. It went before the council for voting, and it got voted down. And there was notice of the meeting, so there were supporters of building it, as well as people that did not think that was a good idea, and it did get voted down. Now, it already had the zoning commission and it already had the economic development stamp of approval from Forest Lake. And usually, not always, things will go through with their pre-work that they've done. And so it ended up, the developer ended up moving it to Carver County, which is way across the Twin Cities. And you probably know, this happened then, but you probably know that right now we don't have enough children's inpatient mental health beds. Right now, there's an ambulance garage being used in Minneapolis to house children for 3 months, 4 months in a garage, right, as inpatient residential for children. And so stories like Not in My Backyard were things like, well, this could be very dangerous having these children in a building, in Forest Lake. And it created, by the way, 100 jobs. And Forest Lake kept saying, oh, we need more jobs in Forest Lake. So the Economic Development Agency was behind it. So I have to say that, it never not in my backyard came up as the words that were said at the council meeting. And there were supporters of it too, including the neighbors that circled the farmland. The farmer who was ready to sell it had already talked to his neighbors about selling it and what he was going to do. And so it's just fascinating to me that even today we still have this not in my backyard. Where do you think our children are living? Our children, where do you think they're living? They're living in maybe a private home, but now they need more care for a short period of time. So where is that going to be? Are we going to send them to Fargo where there aren't enough beds either? Are we going to send them to Sioux Falls where there aren't enough beds either? Are we going to send them to La Crosse where there's not enough beds either? And are we going to house them in a garage? We house kids with cancer in an ambulance garage. Fairview Health, that's where they're using. So that's another issue for another day, right?
Wow.
Yeah,
Disturbing.
it is disturbing. So, why should we care about mental health? I'm preaching to the choir here. You've already self-selected to be here. More people for our workforces. More people can live their best lives. Having good graduation rates, having people have some post-secondary education of some sort, not having people in the criminal justice system and giving them proper care and treatment so they can live a life. Wellness in the community, housing stability, increase happiness for people. I mean, no surprises here. So these are the 5 things, but I thought I just kind of get you started. And I brainstormed by myself at 7 in the morning, right? And so my brainstorming will be not as good as yours will be if you get into some committee work, but I'm just going to throw out a few ideas that I know have worked other places, or I'm adapting them from something else. So a lot of library systems and cities have like a book that they choose for the whole community to read. So I'm like, well, why don't you consider doing that? It engages the whole community, and choose a book that has a mental health theme. And I'll give you an example of what Lakeville did. Lakeville chose a book a number of years ago called Miss Hazel and the Rosa Parks Society. And they had a whole month-long reading. They had events, they had the author come in, and they asked me to come in because there's a mental health theme in the book. And so I had one night where I had at the library, I probably had 45 people, and one was a high school class, English class. The teacher brought her students, and they had all read the book, and we talked about the theme of mental health in that book. Now, there's also racial themes in that book too. It's called the Rosa Parks Society also. So just know that, they had one session, I'm sure another night on some of the racial issues. It's fiction, but it was a good way to get a conversation started about mental illness. The other thing is, I think you can coin the words if you want to, but making it easier to go green. Now, you're thinking that's environmental. Well, it could be, but green is the color for mental health. So you could take October as a mental health week, May is mental health month, make some sort of theme like making it easier to go green, and blanket the town in green. Green lights, green storefronts, green food, and just blanket it with green. The other thing is having a 5-year plan. Maybe you do a 10-year plan, but if the chamber has a plan, where does mental health or wellness fall into your plan? And you maybe already done that. The other thing is having a clearinghouse for resources. It's really hard to keep up a database, so I wouldn't recommend trying to keep up a database. It's almost impossible, but it is good to make sure that people know about some of the basic services like the mobile crisis team for Freeborn County. So you're a clearinghouse for ideas, maybe. One thing is the NAMI National Convention is going to be in Minnesota for, I think, the first time. It's going to be in May, and it's at the Minneapolis Convention Center. So maybe you're the clearinghouse on the chamber website for events like that, like the National NAMI Conference is in Minneapolis, and it moves all around the country. And that's this year. So maybe you're a clearinghouse. The other thing is maybe you become like Gustavus is, they have the Nobel Conference every year. And, that's in St. Peter, and they've been hosting that for, I don't know how many years, 40 years or more. And think of New York Mills. They've had the Great American Think-Off for 30 years. And it brings national attention. They have a big topic and question every year. Well, maybe you become the mental health capital. You can call it whatever you want. Maybe you have a walk team. You know, NAMI has a walk every year. So maybe the Albert Lee contingency comes to the NAMI walk, which is at Minnehaha Falls every year. Maybe you have your own walk. It's not necessarily a NAMI walk, but maybe you have a mental health walk of your own in Albert Lee or in Freeburg County. Maybe you get an affiliate chapter of NAMI started, you seed it. You don't have to be it, but you seed that with members that are chamber members that are interested in that topic. And so I don't know, those are things I brainstorm by myself, you know, at 7 a.m. But I'm sure, you know, you can come up with some of this as well. You've recorded me, so you've got those ideas on tape, and you can come up with better ideas than me. I just wanted to get you started. So, and we do lots of things at NAMI. Take advantage of our classes for your businesses, take advantage of our support groups and tell your employees about them. All of that's on our website. So NAMIMN.org. We have booklets and fact sheets. We just charge, you know, for our booklets and things, we charge cost of printing. So you can have quantities to put in your offices if you would like. And, you know, you could sponsor a mental health concern in your community. I mean, maybe you give seed money to a clinic, or you give seed money to education programs that are being offered by the schools. I mean, there are ways to, you know, support mental health by maybe sponsoring an organization in your community, maybe.
So, Kay, we'll be allowed to use this, like if we wanted to take it to a city council meeting or something, we can use this presentation. You're okay with that?
We're
Okay.
okay, but we'd rather we do it. It's our presentation. So you can ask us, we can, you know, go, you
Oh,
can talk
sure.
about the
Okay.
concept, but if you wanted the presentation, I'd say have one of us do it, and we can do
Okay.
it in person if that's more effective for you, or we can also do it online like this. So
Okay.
no, that's a great
Well,
idea.
So
Yeah.
we're a town of 300 people, and I think there was 3 suicides last year. That's a lot.
That
So
is
that's why, I mean, I brought all of the information, I mean, to the council, but this is a wonderful thing.
Yeah. And we
You're
teach,
doing great.
well, thank you. We teach suicide prevention classes. So if you wanted in the community to host one, you know, there's parameters to it and things like that. But, you know, you can talk to me. I'll put up my email address and things again. But you can talk to me, and we can see if you want to host, you know, something like that. There is in our suicide prevention classes, there's a class limit size, but we could help. So now I'm putting this back, you know, you're already onto this. I mean, Sherry's got you going, but you know, what actionable steps can I take? And Kim already gave one. And so just think, what can I do in my family? Maybe you're going to take my family to family class. I have 3 spots left, you know? I mean, so there's things you can do actionable right away, or there are things you can take back to your organization, not just the chamber, but where you work. I'll stay on for a few minutes. I know you have to go to work. And so I'm sorry, there's so much to talk about, but yeah.
We
Thank
really
you, Kay.
appreciate this so much, Kay. I'm just putting the evaluation for this in the chat right now for everyone to give their feedback. But I also, so many great ideas came out of this, not only the ones that you mentioned, but I was taking some notes here too of some things, the CIT training, and to find out, you know, locally how many we have trained and if there's anything we can do to help further that. I loved the reach out and lean in quote. I also think things like, you know, I know at my church, they say prayers for specific people, but even just requesting that during those prayers, they pray for those suffering with mental illness struggles. So
That's a good idea. We
you know,
don't do
just
that. Mhm.
simple just simple things like that where we can reach out. We do work with our library a lot, but I think there's a lot more we could do possibly with the library. And yeah, I mean, and you know, we can as a group at the next meeting brainstorm, you know, ideas and things, more things that we can do. So thank you so much, Kay, for doing this. We really appreciate it. Does anyone else have anything they want to throw in before we sign off here?
Very interesting. Thank you, Kay.
My pleasure.
Yes, thank you for your time. It was very eye-opening, really. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Yeah, and take
Thank you.
advantage, you know, for your own organizations.
For sure. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording if I can figure out how. I may just have to log off, but okay. Thank you, Kay. I will be in touch, and thank you everyone for getting on this morning. Have a great day.
Bye-bye, thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Yep,
And we'll
bye.
get back to you, Kim.